You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick here with fellow panelist Christopher Zender. Today we discuss marriage and the family. Our welcome guest is Perry Cahall of the Pontifical College Josephinum in Columbus, Ohio. He is the academic dean of the School of Theology and professor of historical theology. Dean Cahall is the author of Living the Mystery of Marriage, Building Your Sacramental Life Together. That's from Hillenbrand Books, 2020. A book whose primary audience is engaged and newly married couples, and also The Mystery of Marriage, a Theology of the Body and the Sacrament. Again, Hillenbrand Books, 2016. That's a book written for use in seminaries and universities. As always, let's begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit we may be always truly wise and never rejoice in this consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Perry, if we may call you that, could you please tell us a bit about yourself and your family?
Sure. I grew up in Southern Ohio, Cincinnati area, went away to school in North Carolina. We've got my MA and PhD in theology at St. Louis University. Taught for 4 years at Ohio Dominican University across town in Columbus, and then after 4 years was hired by the Josephinum, and I've been here now for, this is my 18th year. I was 8 years as a faculty member before becoming dean, and now this is my 10th year in the dean's office. I'm happily married for, it'll be 22 years in October, to my wife Marissa, who also, she has a PhD in clinical psychology. She teaches as an adjunct at the Josephinum every spring, a course in psychology to the guys. And I have 2 kids, a son who's a junior in college and a daughter who's a senior in high school this year. So that's a little bit about me and my family.
Jim, you're muted.
Sorry, I had to mute and unmute. Thanks for that, Perry. What's the history of Pontifical Josephinum College?
I'll try to give you the 60-second version. So the Josephinum was founded by a German immigrant. His name was Monsignor Joseph Jessing. He himself did his seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio, where there was a large German population. He ended up coming to Columbus, and he founded an orphanage up here for German boys. And somewhere along the way, as some of the orphans grew older, a few of them expressed a desire to study for the priesthood. So he founded a seminary. And I think he founded it in 1888, I believe. And then 4 years later, he petitioned Pope Leo XIII in Rome for the pontifical status. That means that the chancellor of the board of the Josephinum is the Apostolic Nuncio to the United States. So there's the if you will, authority chain goes through the nuncio to the Holy See. So everybody thinks he probably did it because at the time there was an Irish bishop in charge of Columbus, and he probably didn't want his seminary to be overseen by an Irish bishop. So he took it out of his hands by petitioning for the pontifical status, and Pope Leo granted it. So it's been operating as a seminary since 1888, pontifical since 1892.
Thanks for that background. One more background question. How did you come to teach at the Josephinum and then move on to be a dean, although you haven't given up the teaching?
No. In fact, one of my requirements for when I was asked to be dean was that I'd be able to teach as much as possible. So I still am in the classroom. The answer to your question in short is God's providence. When I received my graduate degree from St. Louis University, I envisioned getting a job in a small liberal arts college, a Catholic college, and teaching there for the rest of my life. And that's looked like how it was going to be. My first job was at Ohio Dominican, and then the dean at the Josephinum at the time, the academic dean at the Josephinum, knew one of my graduate school professors, and that professor had told me to come see the dean when I got in town. I did, and then after I was at the Ohio Dominican for 2 years, the dean called me and said, "Hey, we need somebody to teach a couple courses. Would you be interested?" I said, "Sure." Taught adjuncted for a couple of years, and then they offered me a full-time position. And after discerning it for a bit with my wife, said, "Well, okay, this is the door God's opening." And I've been here for 18 years.
Very good. Christopher, you want to carry us forward?
Yeah, maybe a little bit more on the history, because I knew a priest in California. We lived in Kern County, which is the mountains and the desert, and he was the circuit priest for many years in the area, and he died at almost the age of 101. Monsignor Francis Pointek, and he attended the Josephinum. He said it was in those days you had to speak German and Latin. I take it that's not a requirement anymore.
No, not anymore, but he is correct. When Joseph Jessing founded it, it was founded precisely to serve German students, German immigrants. So for many years, German was a prerequisite to being admitted. And then over the years, the Josephinum was kind of, I would say, modified its mission, from serving just the German immigrant population to serving the larger nation. We're a national seminary, so we don't belong to the Diocese of Columbus. We're an independent seminary that draws from different dioceses. And most recently, the emphasis has been on ministering to Hispanic immigrants, and the Josephinum has offerings that help guys do that too. So shift, but I still think consistent with the original founding vision of Father Jessing. But there's one funny story about that, and I have seen the original admissions materials, and there was a line in there that said, "The infernal game of baseball shall not be played on the Josephinum's campus," because the Germans hated this American game. And it probably wasn't 15 years after his death, there were 4 different baseball diamonds on the grounds of the Josephinum.
I was also told that at least maybe in the 1930s, the seminarians actually worked in potato field across the street from the.
They did. They had a full-fledged garden. I do know those stories, and I've seen some pictures. So the Josephinum used to own a lot of property that's been sold off over the years, but there's still a good amount of acreage around here. And the students did grow a garden to raise the food that they ate in the cafeteria. So there was even some livestock, I understand, like some goats, some sheep. So yeah, we don't have our seminarians do that anymore, although maybe it'd be a good idea.
Maybe you need another German at the head of it to get them to do that.
That's right.
That's good. Maybe we can move on. Your work on marriage. You've written 2 books on marriage. Why? think it's probably fairly obvious, but what moved you to do that, say, instead of, I don't know, the Trinity or Providence or something of that sort?
Yeah, I think the short answer is God's providence. When I was in grad school, my dissertation topic was actually St. Augustine's theology of marriage and its connection to his Trinitarian theology. And I published a few articles spinning off of that dissertation, and then just over the years was just drawn more and more to teaching and writing about marriage. When I taught at Ohio Dominican, I taught a course there every year called the Theology of Marriage, and that course was always maxed out with a waiting list. At that point in time in our culture, I mean, kids, and I still think this is the case, young people really are desirous of love that lasts. You know, they want true love. And when this course was offered on marriage, they just flocked to it. And it was a very edifying experience teaching that course. And I came over to the Josephinum and was asked to teach a course on marriage, and have been since I arrived here. And just over the years, I had developed enough notes and done enough reading. I thought, maybe one of these days I'll write a book. And I was, again, as Providence would have it, I was asked to teach a course as a visiting professor at the Liturgical Institute at Mundelein Seminary in Chicago, and met the editor-in-chief of Hillenbrand Books one day, and he said, you're here teaching this course on marriage. He said, would you be interested in writing a book for us? Because we're doing this series on the sacraments, each of the sacraments. And I said, actually, I would. So one thing led to another, and 2 books came out of it.
Interesting. It's funny you bring up St. Augustine. One of my daughters read St. Augustine's treatise on the good of marriage. Mm-hmm. And her impression was at the end of it that he didn't see much good in it.
That was part of my interest in it in graduate school, is that Augustine has a fairly bad rap, when it comes to his vision of marriage. And some of that's deserved. I'm not going to lie. But if you pay attention to not only that work, but some of the other works he wrote, he actually has a much more positive vision than people give him credit for.
It's interesting, as Pius XI seemed to think so too.
Yeah, the whole encyclical that Pius XI wrote, Casti Connubii, on chaste marriage, the whole thing is structured around Augustine's 3 goods of marriage that he identifies in that work that you mentioned, on the good of marriage. So, yeah.
Well, let me cut to the contemporary chase.
Okay.
Is marriage a social construct?
No. That's the short answer. It's
well, then what is it? What is it?
Yeah, that's right. So marriage is a created reality. It's exists in nature, and it's a created reality created by God Himself. It's not something that sprung out of some type of human idea. It certainly springs out of natural human desires, which God embeds in our hearts. But from the very first chapters of Genesis, we know God creates marriage as He creates man, male and female, and calls them to become one. And so its origin is with God, and it's the if people ask me, and I've given talks to engaged couples over the years, and I said, if you ask, well, why did God create marriage? The purpose is because it's supposed to be a living sign of His love for us. The whole plan of salvation can be read in terms of a romance, right? I mean, from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible, there's the beginning. You have God instituting marriage with Adam and Eve. The end of the Bible ends with a marriage, the wedding feast of the Lamb, when Christ weds Himself to His church for all eternity. And everything in the middle is this huge love story with God wooing humanity into His love. He seeks to marry us. He seeks to wed Himself to us. So from the dawn of time, marriage exists because God wants there to be this living reminder of how much He loves us, how intensely and how intimately He wants to unite Himself to us. So in short, marriage, to your question, is marriage a social construct? No, it's a created reality, and it has sign value. It's sacrament from the beginning, and Christ raises it to the level of a grace-giving sign, with His coming among us.
That is very well put. sad to say, in Los Angeles, where I sort of live, most discussion of marriage is in terms of so-called homosexual marriage. And I think most of the national focus on marriage, at least since Obergefell, has been on homosexual marriage. But now I wonder, isn't that a contradiction in terms, homosexual marriage?
Yeah, it really is. For marriage to exist, as God created it, it's. I think the place to begin here is to ask, what makes marriage unique, and what makes married love unique among all the types of love that we can experience as human persons. We can experience love of friendship, love of affection, paternal love, filial love. Well, what makes married love unique? And married love is unique because it possesses, basically four qualities. It's a free gift of self. And again, all of this images God's love for us. He gives himself to us freely, and he expects a free gift in return. That's this mutual self-donation of God to us and us to God. That's what the essence of a covenant, the mutual self-donation of persons. So in marriage, the husband and the wife donate themselves to each other in love freely. You can't force somebody to give a free gift of themselves. It's faithful, right? It's exclusive, just between the spouses, right? And God is ever faithful to his spouse, us, the church. It's forever or permanent, right? It's this gift of self that cannot be revoked. And the most distinctive quality of married love, of the marital covenant, is that it's meant to bear fruit, right? Of all loves that we can experience in the world, that's the most identifying, unique feature of married love. That married couples can express their love to each other in a certain way, and 9 months later, you may have to give that expression of love a name, right? So those four qualities define the essence of marriage: free, faithful, permanent, fruitful. And two men and two women cannot, by definition, share that type of love with each other. There is not the complementarity necessary to share that type of love. So homosexual marriage really is a contradiction in terms. It's that in order for a couple to come together and become one flesh, right, and to experience those qualities of married love, there has to be one man and one woman. And again, that's the created institution that God put in place from the dawn of time.
In everyday conversations, excuse that background sound, it's my computer overheating. In every ordinary, everyday situation in which homosexual marriage is discussed, since it is a contradiction in terms, how would you suggest that we refer to
it? The reality of now what's called homosexual marriages, I suppose you could call them homosexual relationships, unions of some sort, but they can't be marriage. And I think what's behind the whole phenomenon of even accepting homosexual unions or relationships as marriages is an amnesia of what marriage is, with all those qualities. That I think we've come to a point in our cultural degeneration, if you will, that people think marriage is just a relationship of convenience, and that it's about the mutual satisfaction of desires for the couple and for the individuals in that relationship. There's not the understanding, which used to be there in our culture, that marriage is a profoundly social institution and has ramifications beyond just me and my spouse, right? That for centuries, societies have governed how people enter into marital unions because there's the recognition that union can offer something to the society that no other relationship can, namely more citizens. But when we come to the point where marriage is just seen as a relationship of mutual convenience and mutual self-satisfaction without reference to children, right? Then it's a legitimate question to ask if I'm a gay man living with my lover, and I have a heterosexual couple across the street who's married, right? But they've told me that they permanently sterilize themselves. They never intend to have children from the start. it's a legitimate question for me to ask as a gay man. Well, why can't what I have with my lover be considered what they have? Mm-hmm. So it's behind the whole acceptance of homosexual marriage is this, the forgetfulness or the rejection of certain of the goods, right? Certain of the key qualities of married love, in particular children.
I know you're well aware of this, and perhaps more aware of it than I am. Excuse me, but your position, which is my position, which is Christopher's position, which is the church's position, is strikingly at odds with the zeitgeist. For example, here in Los Angeles, the annual Gay Pride Parade has over 100,000 people in it. And on this program, we've had a lot of people that in various ways present positions that are radical in the eyes of this world. But our position, your position, the church's position on marriage and its theological framework is as radical as anything could be. Here in Los Angeles, no one in public office would speak the way you're speaking. And per impossibile, were someone to speak that way, the newspapers would be excoriating him or her. What's your take on all of this? I mean, it's one thing to be in Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah.
It's one thing to live where Christopher Zender lives, but suppose you're in a major metropolis.
Well, you might be surprised to know that I think it was no more than 5 years ago, Columbus was rated as the most gay-friendly city in the country. So we have a huge, population of people who are professedly homosexual, and we have our own gay pride parade here every year. But I think, in response to your question, I think that the reason why homosexual relationships have become more accepted, and now we've gone to the point of transgenderism and beyond, is because of what I think John Paul II mentions in Veritatis Splendor, his encyclical on morality and teaching morality in the church. That he says, and I'm paraphrasing, but at a certain point in that encyclical, he says that the many, if not most, of the modern world's ills are due to a misunderstanding of freedom, and that what the church needs to do is evangelize the concept of freedom. And so his point is that when the distorted vision of freedom that our culture operates with is freedom as the ability to do whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want, even if that means somehow recreating my own nature. Really means you're making myself my own God. It goes right back to the opening story in Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve, and with that great symbolic vision of plucking this fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, have made this decision to create their own moral universe without reference to God. And that's the counterfeit vision of freedom that the evil one, enticed them to believe. And when that vision of freedom, this, radical autonomous freedom takes hold in a culture, then, well, okay, for you to tell me that I can't sexually love somebody that I want to love, well, then that's an impingement upon or a barrier to me expressing my freedom. Instead of understanding freedom as not the ability to do whatever I want, but the ability to abide in the truth, right? And that only the truth sets us free. Jesus tells us that in John's Gospel, chapter 8. Right? The truth will set you free.
The focus on freedom and how that's the core issue seems to me to be right on. I've mentioned before that the editorial board of the Los Angeles Times, in its position paper, cites freedom without any gloss as its first and foremost value. First and foremost value. And of course, what they mean is negative freedom, absence of restrictions. Well, ironically, they're willing to restrict any number of other views. Let me push you a little bit farther here, and
Sure.
then Christopher needs to take over. When you talk about love and a homosexual person talking about the love of a same-sex union, we really don't even want to call that love, do we? Because love is wanting the good of another and working steadily to realize that good. But such a union is a counterfeit. It's not a good. So if we put all our cards on the table, and what a lame metaphor that is, if we're utterly frank, we don't want to call that love. I mean, I remember when a pastor here referred to in an observance of the 40th day of the death of a homosexual member of a homosexual couple, referred to his lover. And I thought, well, his sexual partner perhaps, but lovers are a lover is someone who loves, but that sort of love, in quotes, really isn't love, is it?
Yeah, I think these are great questions. I want to preface what I'm about to say by anyone who listens to this interview should understand that the church, everybody in the church, should have real love and compassion for people struggling with same-sex attraction. In a fallen world, we all deal with our own desires that are not ordered properly. And we have to somehow, and there's only two choices in this life. Either we master our desires or they master us. And if they master us, we become slaves to our own desires. And we all have desires that tend to, get out of control or not be properly oriented. And same-sex desire, same-sex attraction, I think, is a particularly difficult cross to bear. And we all in the church, I think, should be, truly loving these people. As you say, the essence of love is willing the good of the other, to help them understand that by acting out on this desire, which is not properly ordered in the sexual realm, that by acting out on it, it's not going to bring happiness, because it cannot ever realize what it seeks, which is true intimacy and union and a communion between persons. And that body-soul union between persons is only possible on the sexual level, right, between a man and a woman. Any other attempt to have that type of union with somebody of the same sex is always and everywhere going to be frustrated. And it's not going to do them any good. But more directly to your question, there are two things I wanted to mention. You mentioned, an understanding of freedom without restrictions. I'm not sure that we want to talk about restrictions on freedom. We just need to understand freedom properly. That freedom is the ability to live in accord with the nature that God has given me. Right. So if true freedom is living in accord with the truth about my person that comes from Almighty God. So if I may have the desire to fly, and crawl up to the steeple of the Josephinum and jump off and flap my arms as if they're wings, but that desire is self-destructive because it's not in accord with the type of being that God has made me to be, right? But if we live in accord with the nature that God has given us, endowed us with, as human persons made male and female in his image, then, we're on the road to happiness. And it's not that there are restrictions there. It's just we're acting in accord with the truth of our nature, with the truth of our being. Right, so that's one comment. The other one, directly to your comment about love and homosexual unions. I think that our culture is doing an incredible disservice to everybody, but especially young people. I see this all the time. the subtle and not so subtle message that's being sent is that you can't really love somebody unless you have sex with them. And it conflates all different types of attraction with sexual attraction. So we have young people in high school age, for instance, thinking that, well, because I'm intellectually attracted to somebody of the same sex, or even emotionally attracted to somebody of the same sex, like, well, I must be, gay or bisexual, and then I'm encouraged to act out on this. And no, we need to make distinctions. You can have, and there are distinctions between different types of love. Sexual, romantic, eros, erotic love, married love can only be shared between a man and a woman. But you can have deep friendship love between two people of the same gender, right? I have many male friends. I love them dearly, right? But I don't have to have sex with them to love them. I love my brother and my father dearly, right? But I don't have to have sex with them to love them. Everything has been flattened out, and I think there's an intentional agenda to confuse young people to say that all types of attraction and all types of love must be expressed in sexual activity. And that's just false. That's a road to ruin. Is that a sufficient answer to your question?
It certainly is, and I much appreciate it.
So two men and two women can, who even experience same-sex attraction can have a real, true, virtuous friendship, but they need not have sex with each other.
Yes, I think one of the results of what we might call a homosexualized culture is that same-sex friendships are put in jeopardy.
Yes,
There's a sense of suspicion that develops.
I agree with you. Yes.
Well, I'm sure Christopher has much to add. Christopher.
Yeah, my question has to do, and this will be a preface what I'm going to say next, has to do with how when we speak about these things amongst ourselves, it all makes sense to us because we share the same worldview. Sure. We share the same philosophical foundations. I'm thinking of, I'm going into downtown Columbus to the Short North or something like that, and I'm going to talk to people. How do I do that? And I think the problem is, I agree with you, there's a distorted view of freedom, and that's at the root of it. But I think even deeper, there's a philosophical problem, and that's what I would call nominalism, that there are no real natures. You spoke of natures, yeah. But I think the assumption in our society, whether it's clearly thought out or not, is that there are no natures, that what we call natures are merely names we impose upon things. And therefore, all that's left is will, right? Yeah. And so I will this is the pleasure I want to have, and I will that it be right for me. So when we're dealing with that kind of philosophical error, how do we speak to people? And I think too, at another level, when we make the distinction between natural marriage and sacramental marriage. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the history of natural marriage, we see natural marriage exists under all sorts of different forms. Indissolubility often doesn't seem to be really part and parcel of it. I think of in Iceland, one of the Icelandic sagas I read, Njál's saga, the fellow just decides to divorce his wife right at a banquet, and he does it. Indissolubility doesn't seem to be a part of it. We have polygamy. When we're talking to people who are of a nominalist bent and who maybe look at the history of marriage and see these idiosyncrasies in it or contradictions to what we're actually developing, how do we speak to them? What do we say?
No, I think that's a great question. And Christopher, I agree with you. And in fact, this kind of radical, indeterminate, autonomous view of freedom has its origins in nominalism. Right? So if you want to trace back, from whence comes this radical vision of freedom that's dominating our culture right now, you trace it back to William of Ockham and nominalism. Right? Because Ockham would maintain something so ridiculous as there are no natures; they're just names of things. Right? Hence nominalism. And that God is radically free, right? And that it's so radically free that he could flip the 10 Commandments inside out, and all those things that are listed as wrong could be right tomorrow if God so decided. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, that's preposterous. It's bad metaphysics, it's bad philosophy, it's bad everything, right? But the seeds of this modern view of freedom are right there, right, in that nominalist movement. So how do you speak to a nominalist? Well, I think, if you have somebody that's willing to engage, right, and that's one thing. There has to be a willingness to engage. I've found over the years that I only enter into these conversations with people if they really want to have a conversation. I give you, for instance, like I had this is many years ago. I was in graduate school at the time. I met up with some of my high school friends, and one of them brought a guy along. We went out to a bar to have some drinks and get some dinner. One of my friends brought along a friend of his from college, and the minute he found out, that I was studying Catholic theology, he started ripping into Catholic teachings, and I was okay, So at a certain point in the conversation, I said, look, I'm happy to have this conversation, but only if this is, a conversation where we're both honest with each other. And I'm honest with you in saying that I have found happiness in living in accord with the church's teachings, because I believe those teachings are themselves from God. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you want. And quickly, the conversation took this turn towards the sexual arena, right? And in this conversation, this man started talking very quickly about, the different sexual encounters he was having with different women. And I said, look, we can talk about these issues. He was talking about premarital sex and contraception. And I said, I'm happy to talk about these issues. But I said, we need to be honest with each other. I'm honest with you in telling you that I have found happiness in living in accord with these teachings. And I want you to be honest with yourself. I have no idea what inspired me to ask this question. But I said to him, I need you to be honest with yourself. In these sexual encounters that you just revealed to me, at the end of those encounters, did you feel happy and fulfilled and content? Or did you sit there or lie there in bed and feel like some part of you had died? And his response was, he started to cry. Right. And I think somehow we have to get our interlocutors to be honest, to show them that we're willing to engage in this conversation with love, and it can't degenerate into some type of shouting match or argument. I mean, we have to just stand confidently in the truth. The truth doesn't need me to defend it. Jesus doesn't need me to defend him. What he needs me is for me to present the truth and present him with as much love as I can, so that people see how glorious he and the truth is. Mm-hmm. And so when we have to engage with these nominalists on that level, to get them, to be honest with themselves, to show that we're genuine in what we're bringing to the table, right? And then you can start asking questions like, okay, well, if you really don't believe there is such a thing as a human nature, right, that it's just a name that then what do you and I and this girl sitting next to you and that guy over there, what do we have in common? Do we do nothing? Because if you're really serious that there is no such thing as a human nature, then we can't talk about any commonalities that any of us have, mm-hmm. Right? But it's somehow getting to the root level of honesty in these conversations. And I think that it can only be done, in some ways it's an appeal to the emotions, right? Because our culture lives on the level of emotion anymore. The whole modernism itself, right, was an over-reliance upon reason as opposed to faith. Well, in the postmodern world, it's postmodern precisely because there's even an agnosticism, if you will, regarding reason. Reason can't be trusted either. So you're just left wallowing in emotions, and our culture just emotes all over the place. Okay, well, so let's engage there, right? Mm-hmm. Are you really happy, right? Are you really content? And then to your other question about the idiosyncrasies that they might notice in natural marriage, my first inclination to engage with that is, is to just restate, as a Christian, it's revealed to us that God intended this union to be between one man and one woman from the beginning. Now, in all those cultural idiosyncrasies you just mentioned, polygamy, polyandry, all of these, if you will, departures from the norm, what has happened in those cultures? Right? What has been the end result of that type of behavior? Right? And it's never been good. Mm-hmm. Right. It's never, there's not stability. There are always problems, even in, to get back to sacred scripture, you see polygamy and, existing throughout the Old Testament period. But it's clear that monogamy is held up as the norm and the model, right? And every time you see polygamous relationships emerging in the stories of the patriarchs, beginning with Abraham, there's always dysfunction that results. And that happens on a cultural level. If something other than natural marriage as designed by God becomes the norm, the whole society starts to experience dysfunction.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember reading St. Thomas on this years ago. I think the distinction he makes is that polygamy is not unnatural, but it's not according to nature, right?
Yes.
And he brings up that point that every time you see it in the Old Testament, it has bad results, right?
Yes.
Which shows that. So maybe one of the things you were doing, not necessarily on a philosophical level, when you were speaking to your friend, was you're trying to get him to see his assumptions.
Yeah.
I wonder if a lot of people don't see their assumptions, because you talk to people. I mean, people in rural Ohio, at least, they seem to have an innate sense that there are natures.
Yeah, and most people do.
Yeah, I mean, we're not aided by the fact that much of Protestant discourse is based on the notion that these things are wrong simply because God says so. Right.
That's voluntarism.
Right. So, which is ultimately, Luther was a nominalist, and it's rooted in that. So, I guess what we're doing, we're trying to get them to see their assumptions and to work up from those assumptions to something else.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Which you're right. I mean, in a kind of unknowing way, and I think the Holy Spirit was guiding that conversation. That was what was going on. To type of prompt some type or invite into some type of self-examination or examination of what is the basis for your position.
Mm-hmm. It seems even we Catholics don't do too well at this marriage business lately. We're not, to what degree it's based on sharing the assumptions of society, but when I went to a small Catholic college, and I graduated in 1987, and I remember people I knew got married from the college, and we all had the ideal of or the goal, the intention of remaining married till death. But I know a number of my classmates, people who are solid Catholics, who knew the Church's teachings, yet have gotten divorced.
Yeah.
We see this in what is going on with Catholics. What is it? Why is this the sharp decline? Not just amongst Sunday Catholics who might not know any better, but even amongst solid Catholics. What's happening?
That's an excellent question. I mean, that would be a great sociological study, but and all I can do is kind of postulate my own, hypotheses. I think it is, again, goes back to this concept of freedom it's taken hold in our culture. And that somehow making a permanent commitment is somehow restrictive, right? Of my freedom, it blocks off certain options, and I think the Church never exists in a vacuum. The Church always exists within a particular cultural matrix, and I think that Catholics we've allowed ourselves to be infected by that contagion of false freedom, and it's just. Young people are awash in it. It's when my grandparents got married, they were World War II generation Catholics, and they got married at a very young age. They didn't need a marriage preparation phase to tell them what they were getting into. Mm-hmm. They freely committed themselves to each other. They knew it was faithful. They knew it was for life, and they purposefully got married because they wanted to start a family. Right? They knew what marriage was and it was in the air that they breathed at the time. Right, the air that we breathe now, especially in the post-Obergefell world, there is nothing in the air that young people breathe that can give them a sense of what marriage is. It just doesn't exist anymore. So, as a church, and I mean as a church, not just bishops and priests, but all of us, Catholic parents, all of us need to be very explicit in teaching our children and teaching whoever needs to be taught what marriage is. Because if they don't understand it, then sure, it just becomes some type of social contract or piece of paper. And you see multiple celebrities living in that situation. And young people say, well, this is just, a formality, without understanding that, no, it's not a formality, right? This is responding to an innate desire that you have, that God has planted in your heart, to give yourself away in love to another, to image his love for you, right? So I don't know if that's a sufficient answer to your question, but it is true, as you said, there's a declining number of weddings in the Catholic churches over the past 10 to 20 years. Young people are just choosing not to get married because they don't see the point in it. Mm-hmm. And they don't see the point in it because they really don't understand what it is.
Right. And I mean, it's a deeper question. I mean, it's a deeper problem, it seems to me, because so many Catholics don't even know their faith in other areas. There's been not only a decline in Catholic sense of marriage, but Catholic sense of being Catholic.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you're in that situation, the culture does become predominant. The culture is the chief influencer.
Yeah. It's who's teaching you, right? And if it's not Jesus, if it's not his church, well, then who is giving you the guideposts for your life? Mm-hmm. Some blog somewhere, some internet personality, some TikTok sensation.
Yeah.
I'm going to get back into this. Let me apologize to listeners because my computer, and Christopher knows about this, overheats easily. So I'm going to approach the level of rant, which will only make my computer overheat more rapidly. A couple, 3 or 9 points. Point number 1, thanks for that update on Columbus, Ohio. I didn't realize that. So thanks for that. Next thought is, I certainly appreciate your wanting, I want the same thing, to bring these discussions that we're having now in some preliminary way, at least, to people who might be interested in them. And your personal story there of the fellow who broke down in tears is really remarkable. How could anyone forget that? At the same time, in the public forum, in the political life of, say, a state like California, you can pretty well assume that most people don't want to have that kind of conversation.
Yeah.
And so you could just never address the question. But at the same time, public institutions are taking the position that, in fact, marriage is just a social contract, a construct that at most is a social contract. So you think about the gospel, preach the word in season and out of season. And so it seems to me that in many contexts, we simply have to take the discussion forward, whether we're welcomed or not. And we can pretty much assume that we're not welcomed. But if say you live in California, you know that public education reflects the very opposite of the Catholic view and vision of marriage. And so you have to engage. Now, it seems to me that at a philosophical level, at a dialectical level, it's fairly easy to point to the self-referential problem that sexual libertarians have. For example, they want to accuse one of being bigoted. Well, you might very well say, well, what is it to be a bigot? And then at some point they'll have to talk about respecting people for what they are. And then you could say, well, what are they? What in fact are they? And that leads, I think, to it's courtesy of moral discourse necessarily involving commitments to natures. It leads to an opportunity to engage an unwilling opponent And if an opponent is seriously unwilling, the opponent is, I think, in time, just going to leave the field of engagement, which itself is indicative that there's something amiss there. I mean, you're supposed to follow the argument, aren't you? Well, this is what an argument is. It involves a valid form with true premises. That's how you get a sound argument. And the reason why, of course, as Chesterton reminds us, that people quarrel so much is they don't know how to argue. So I think we have to insist in the public square, not every day, every moment of every day, but often enough so that people know who we are in terms of political positions. Engage them. Now, I don't think that was a rant, but I think there are ways that we can look for the ideal moment, but the ideal moment is hard to find in a political context in which the opposition is increasingly entrenched. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. And the problem is, as you noted, like when you're engaged with an interlocutor who really is not willing to engage in legitimate dialogue and legitimate argument, and is closed off to considering, what you're saying. Oftentimes in our contemporary culture, what happens is then the name calling, and the kind of vitriol that it gets spewed out of, well, you're just a hater, and I'm not. And you have this conflation in that dialogue of, well, if you disagree with your interlocutor's opinion or their position, that somehow you're disrespecting them as a person. Again, that's because we're living in our culture on the level of emotions in this postmodern world. So when I was teaching at Ohio Dominican, teaching young men and women, one of the things I said in every one of the classes I taught was, we need to understand how to enter into the academic dialogue here, right? Everybody is welcome to express, your position or your opinion, but you have to support it, right? That's what, having premises and supporting your argument and arguing to a large logical conclusion, that's what it's about. And if I or anybody else in the classroom disagrees with your opinion, it's not somehow lashing out at you as a person, but it is critiquing and analyzing your argument, right? But in public discourse, and certainly in political discourse, we're far afield from that. I'm not sure if it can be recovered, but on the personal level, on the individual level, I think we can do our part, right? And to the extent that any of us have a public voice engaging these ideas in our culture, we just adopt the proper mode of entering into argument. I am sometimes very concerned, about conservative politicians or Orthodox Catholics who get in these debates online or whatever, and then it does degenerate into a quarrel. No, I mean, again, the truth doesn't need me to defend it. Jesus doesn't need me to defend him. All he needs me to do is to present him and his truth in the most beautiful way possible, in a logically coherent way, right? I don't know that I have a definitive answer, to what you're saying. It's just, you can't adopt the rules of engagement that are currently operative, in politics and in our culture. You have to educate people or bring people along to understand. Look, I'll take another personal example of this. When I was in college, I came to know a young woman her mother was an executive in Planned Parenthood. And she came to learn that I was Catholic, right? And this conversation arose at a party one evening, and we stayed late into the evening. Because it came to, she was kind of hurling objections at the Catholic Church, and I said to her, look, I'm willing to have this discussion with you, but you understand that, I'll try my best, to answer the questions you have about church teaching, but you need to know that I hold these dear, right? And nothing I am saying, is in an intention of offending you, but I want you to come away with this conversation with an understanding of why the church teaches what it does. Whether you believe it or not is between you and the grace of God, but this is going to be a conversation about understanding each other's positions. Because I'm not going to stand here and shout at you, and I don't want you shouting at me. We had the best conversation until 2 a.m, right? And she said to me at the end, she said, I don't agree with you and everything the church teaches, but she said, I do understand now why you hold those positions. And I said, that's all I can ask. Right? And that's all we can ask, to enter into that type of honest dialogue with people, where you really are talking about ideas, presenting arguments instead of just constantly yelling at each other.
Excellent. Christopher, we're getting close to our end here. Do you have some thoughts that you want to share, as they say, knowing that we're happy to hear you out and we think highly of you?
I don't know how many thoughts I had. I think I've expressed most of those thoughts. I wonder if, being that you are dean in a seminary, if you ever run across, when I read sometimes older histories, and even some more modern ones, there's this basic sense that the Catholic Church upholds celibacy as the highest ideal in virginity, and that there really is hidden in that a disdain for marriage. That the celibates hold the highest level. It's when we do call the celibate vocation, the vocation of virginity, a higher vocation than marriage. But how do you run across it? Do people challenge you and say, well, really, all you really are pushing is virginity, and marriage is just sort of concession for the weak?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, there's I'm trying to think. Well, I can't think of the text right now, but you can see celibacy as a sign of contradiction in some ways. Like, and a lot of people outside the church, and some people inside the church, look at the celibate life or consecrated virgin life and say, okay, well, you're hypocrites. You're saying that that marriage is a good thing, but this is really the good thing, and you're just kind of pushing people. Marriage is second class citizenry. But now we do have to acknowledge that there have been distortions in piety throughout the centuries of the church where that type of thing was happening.
Right.
Where you even had in the Middle Ages an encouragement on the part of monks trying to encourage married people to live celibate marriages, because that was the better thing to do. So you have to acknowledge.
Yeah, or Saint Bernard encouraging his brothers to leave their wives.
Yes. Right. So you have to acknowledge those distortions when you see them, right? But I'm going to turn to John Paul II in his Theology of the Body to answer this question. He points out that a true understanding of celibacy or consecrated virginity as a higher calling has nothing to do, it implies nothing negative about marriage, right? And he says that it's higher because it's a sign of the eschaton, the end times, the resurrected life. When, as Jesus says in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, we will be neither married nor given in marriage, right? So in the eschaton, we all exist in union with the one spouse, Jesus. Right? That's the marriage in the end. Marriage is given by God, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, as a sign of that ultimate union. And especially the sacrament of marriage itself, right, as this grace state in which a couple encounters Christ through each other continually through their lives and are called to God by God to a deeper level of holiness by growing in virtue and overcoming vice. Marriage is a sign of that ultimate reality. Okay, but when you experience that ultimate reality, the sign is no longer needed. Right. Now, that doesn't mean that you and I will love our spouses any less, than we do now. In fact, we'll love them more, but our love for them will be perfected and subordinated in our love for Christ, who is the one bridegroom. Celibates and consecrated virgins are foreshadowing that life, right? It's higher in the sense that it's a sign of, the resurrected life, a higher mode of existence, right? So, and the two vocations are perfectly compatible and complementary, right? It's just in a brief minute. What John Paul II helps us understand is that married people need the witness of consecrated virgins and celibates to remind us that we cannot ultimatize or absolutize our marriages, that our love for each other as spouses has to be subordinated to our love for Christ. Look at Ephesians 5, the way it begins. Mutually subordinate yourselves to each other out of reverence for Christ, right? And the living example of the consecrated virgin or celibate reminds married spouses of the consecrated aspect of their marriage. Right? They've been consecrated to Christ first in their baptism and secondly in their marital union. And the word consecration is apt. Like the couple is consecrated to Christ in their marital union. Okay, flip it around. Consecrated virgins and celibates need holy married people, holy married couples, to be a constant reminder to them of the relationship that they've entered into is a nuptial relationship. Right? They cannot live their lives as if they're some type of, old disgruntled bachelor or bitter old biddy, right? That they're in a nuptial relationship with Christ and his church, and they will only find happiness to the extent that they realize that nuptial call. And married couples are a constant reminder to them of that, right? So far from being contradictory or from the church being hypocritical, there are two different calls that are different ways, as John Paul II says, of realizing oneself as a nuptial gift. They go together. Hopefully that was helpful. Christopher, you're muted. Excuse me.
Thank you. That was helpful. I'm thinking too, the view about the negative view of marriage held in the past is really overblown. I'm familiar with a book called Monks on Marriage. I can't remember the name of the author, but if I can find it, I'll send it.
Yeah, send me a link to it. Yes.
Yeah, it's a very good book, and I think it shows that the stereotype of the monastic who is negative about marriage, who despises marriage, doesn't really meet the evidence. And then, of course, St. John Chrysostom's homilies, sermons on marriage, I think.
No, it was never the dominant. It was never the dominant spirituality or in the life of the church. And I think to make the distortions the norm is a disservice. Mm-hmm. But you just have to acknowledge that distortions existed.
We're at the end. As always, we could go another hour or so easily. I want to thank you for your work. And I would think that your courses would be terrific. Looking back, I finished my senior year, second semester, taking a marriage course on marriage, and got married the next week. So there was a real, as you might put it, work of providence there. Now, we always end with the gospel for today, and this is a gospel that reminds us that God's word is sharper than any two-edged sword. Jesus said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of dead men's bones and every kind of filth. Even so, on the outside you appear righteous, but inside you are filled with hypocrisy and evil doing. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the memorials of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have joined them in shedding the prophets' blood. Thus you bear witness against yourselves that you are the children of those who murdered the prophets. Now fill up what your ancestors measured out. Come, Lord Jesus, come." Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's very enjoyable.
Godspeed.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.